The evening sky was beginning to change colors, turning from a bright orange to a dim purple as the sun slowly disappeared behind the row of tall trees. The streets were calm, the kind of calm that comes only after a long day of noise, traffic, and rushing people trying to get home. Ethan Cole sat inside his delivery van looking at the clock on the dashboard. It was 7:42 p.m. He was almost done for the day. Just one more parcel to drop off before heading back to the warehouse. His body was tired, his back sore from sitting too long, and his stomach had been reminding him that he hadn't eaten since noon. But the thought of getting home, taking a shower, and having dinner with his wife kept him going. He was a simple man. Never caused trouble, never looked for attention, just did his work and went home. People at his job liked him because he was reliable, never complained, and always helped others when they needed it. As he drove through the neighborhood, something caught his eye near the corner of the street. It was an old woman, maybe in her late 70s, struggling to lift a grocery bag that had clearly torn open. A few apples had rolled across the pavement, and she was bending slowly to pick them up, one by one. Cars were passing by, but no one stopped. Most people were too busy, staring at their phones or thinking about getting home. Ethan slowed down. He looked at the clock again. He was already a bit behind schedule. The company had recently installed GPS trackers in all their delivery vans to monitor routes and timing. The management said it was to improve efficiency, but everyone knew it was just to make sure drivers didn't waste a second. Every minute counted, every detour recorded. He sat there for a few seconds, watching her from his seat. His mind told him to just keep going, to finish his last delivery and go home. But his heart said something different. He could see the old woman's hands shaking as she tried to pick up the apples. Her thin coat barely covered her shoulders, and the wind was getting colder. Ethan sighed, pulled his van to the side, and turned on the hazard lights. "It'll just take a minute," he told himself as he got out. He walked over and smiled gently. "Ma'am, do you need a hand?" The woman looked up, surprised but relieved. "Oh dear, thank you," she said softly. "These bags are heavier than I thought. I shouldn't have tried to carry them all by myself." "It's all right," Ethan said, kneeling down to pick up the apples that had rolled under a nearby car. "Let me help you with these." They both laughed a little when he almost crawled on his knees to grab the last apple. She told him her name was Margaret, and she had just come from the small grocery store 3 blocks away. Normally her son helped her with shopping, but he was out of town that week. She didn't want to bother anyone, so she decided to do it herself. Ethan noticed that she was breathing heavily and that her hands were trembling slightly. "Do you live nearby?" he asked. "Yes, just around the corner," she said, pointing to a small house down the street. "It's not far, but it feels far when you're my age." Ethan smiled. "Well, I can give you a ride or at least help carry these for you." "Oh, that's too kind," she said, hesitating. "I don't want to keep you from your work." "It's fine," Ethan said kindly. "Work can wait a few minutes." She smiled gratefully, and together they began walking toward her home. Ethan carried the 2 heavy bags while Margaret walked slowly beside him, talking about how she had lived in that neighborhood for over 40 years. She told him about her late husband, how they used to sit on the porch and watch kids play on the street, and how the town had changed so much since then. Ethan listened quietly, nodding now and then. He didn't mind the small talk. In fact, it felt nice. His job usually kept him on the move. No time to slow down, no time to connect with people. But walking beside Margaret reminded him of his own grandmother, who used to say, "Kindness is never wasted, even if no one sees it." When they reached her house, she unlocked the door and invited him inside. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then followed her to the small kitchen, just to set the bags on the counter. The house was simple but warm. Old photographs on the wall, the smell of tea, and a cat sleeping on a chair near the window. "Thank you, young man," Margaret said with a smile as she opened her purse. "Please, let me give you something for your time." Ethan quickly shook his head. No, please. You don't have to do that." "But you helped me," she said. "People don't stop for strangers anymore." "I didn't do it for money," he said gently. "Just promise me you won't try to carry those heavy bags alone again." Margaret chuckled softly. "All right, I promise." Ethan smiled and started to leave, but she stopped him for a moment. "Wait," she said, walking to the counter. She poured him a cup of tea and handed it to him. "At least take this. It's cold outside." He accepted it mostly because he didn't want to be rude. The tea was warm and sweet, the kind that made you feel calm inside. They talked for another few minutes before Ethan realized the time. When he looked at his watch, his heart dropped. He was 20 minutes late. He quickly stood up. "I really have to go, ma'am. Thank you for the tea." Margaret thanked him again and waved as he hurried back to his van. The streetlights were on now and the night had turned quiet again. He jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and took a deep breath. He knew his supervisor would see the delay on the GPS report. He told himself maybe it wouldn't be a big deal. Maybe they wouldn't notice a few extra minutes. But deep down, he knew they would. The company he worked for didn't care much about stories or reasons. They cared about timestamps, delivery numbers, and performance graphs. Ethan had seen coworkers get written up for being just 5 minutes late or for taking an unapproved route. Still, he didn't regret stopping. He thought about the smile on Margaret's face and how grateful she had been. That was worth something more than a perfect schedule. He finished his last delivery, locked the van, and drove back to the warehouse. When he parked, the security guard gave him a small nod. But his supervisor, who usually stood near the office, was already gone for the night. Ethan signed out, dropped his keys in the box, and went home. At home, his wife noticed he looked more tired than usual. "Long day?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, sitting down and taking off his shoes. "Had a small delay on the way back. Helped an old woman with her groceries," she smiled. "That sounds like you." "I just hope my boss sees it that way," he said, half joking. She touched his shoulder and said, "You did the right thing. Don't let anyone make you feel bad for that." Ethan nodded but couldn't shake the small worry that lingered in his mind. He had worked at that company for 5 years. He knew how strict they had become lately. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he thought about Margaret again. How alone she seemed. How thankful she had been for a small act of kindness. He wondered if anyone would help his own mother like that if she ever needed it. That thought made him feel a little better. Before falling asleep, he checked his phone and saw a message from a coworker. "Heard the boss is checking GPS reports again tonight. Hope you were on time." Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, then put the phone down. "Whatever happens, happens," he whispered to himself. "I'd do it again if I had to." The next morning, the sun rose slowly, painting the sky in soft shades of pink. Birds chirped outside and the world seemed calm. Ethan didn't know that his small act of kindness would soon turn his life upside down. That one simple choice to help someone would lead to something he never expected. For now, he just got dressed, had his coffee, and drove to work like any other day, unaware that the kindness he showed the night before was already setting something much bigger into motion. Ethan woke up early the next morning, though he hadn't slept much. His mind kept going back to the GPS tracker on the van and the thought that his little delay might be noticed. He tried to brush it off as he got ready for work. The air was cool and a thin mist covered the streets. Everything looked calm, but his stomach felt tight with worry. He arrived at the warehouse a few minutes before his shift. The place was already busy, drivers checking their routes, forklifts moving boxes, and the smell of diesel and coffee mixing in the air. It was a normal morning, but something about the way people looked at him made him uneasy. A few coworkers nodded in greeting, others seemed distracted. As Ethan was loading his van, his supervisor, Mr. Reynolds, came out of the office. He was a tall man with a sharp face and a habit of checking his watch every few minutes. He didn't smile much, and when he did, it was usually because someone else was in trouble. "Ethan," he called out. His tone was flat, but there was something cold behind it. "In my office now." Ethan froze for a second. He put down the clipboard and followed him. The office was small, with plain white walls and a single desk covered in paperwork. Mr. Reynolds sat behind it, typing something on his computer before turning to face him. "Do you know why I called you in?" he asked. Ethan hesitated. I'm not sure." Mr. Reynolds turned the screen toward him. On it was a map with a red line, his delivery route from the night before. A small section of the line curved off the main road. The timestamp showed he had stopped for 20 minutes. "You took a detour last night," the supervisor said, "and you were late returning the van." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I stopped to help someone. An elderly woman had dropped her groceries. She was struggling and—" Mr. Reynolds cut him off. "You know company policy. No unauthorized stops. No delays." "I understand, but it wasn't like I went sightseeing," Ethan said quietly. She needed help. It only took a few minutes. The supervisor leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. 23 minutes to be exact. Do you realize how much one delay affects the entire route schedule? It's not about a few minutes. It's about reliability. Ethan took a deep breath. With respect, sir, I've been working here 5 years. I've never missed a shift, never lost a package, never been late before. I just thought, you thought? Mr. Reynolds repeated sharply. You're paid to follow rules, not to think about which ones matter and which ones don't. There was a long silence. Ethan could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Mr. Reynolds looked down at a form on his desk. We can't make exceptions. If we start letting one driver bend the rules, soon everyone will. The company has to stay consistent. So you're firing me? Ethan asked quietly. The supervisor didn't look up. Effective immediately. You'll receive your final paycheck by the end of the week. Turn in your uniform and ID badge before you leave. For a moment, Ethan just stood there. He couldn't quite believe it. For helping someone? He asked softly. Mr. Reynolds didn't answer. He only said, You can collect your things from your locker. Ethan nodded, though his throat felt tight. He walked out slowly, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. A few co-workers looked up from their vans, whispering to each other. One of them, a man named Steve, approached quietly. What happened? He asked. They let me go, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. Steve frowned. Because of that old lady you helped? Ethan nodded. Yeah, policy violation. Steve shook his head. That's messed up, man. You were one of the best drivers here. Doesn't matter, Ethan said. They care about numbers, not people. He went to his locker, emptied it into a small box. His gloves, water bottle, and a few personal items. He looked at the photo of his wife and daughter taped to the inside of the door, then carefully peeled it off and put it in his pocket. When he turned around, a few co-workers were watching him, silent. They didn't say much, but their eyes showed sympathy. He walked out of the warehouse slowly, carrying the box. As he reached the parking lot, the morning sun hit his face. It should have been a normal day, but everything felt different, heavier. Ethan sat in his old car for a few minutes, staring at the steering wheel. He felt angry, but mostly disappointed. He had given that job everything. He'd worked late nights, weekends, and even through storms. And yet, the one time he followed his heart, it cost him everything. When he got home, his wife was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. She turned around and smiled at first, but her smile faded when she saw the box in his hands. What happened? She asked, worried. Ethan placed the box on the table and sighed. They fired me. What? Why? He rubbed his forehead. Remember the old woman I helped last night? They said I broke company rules by stopping. She stared at him, trying to understand. But you were helping someone. I know, he said softly. They didn't care. She walked over and hugged him tightly. That's not fair. You did the right thing. Ethan hugged her back, his voice low. It doesn't feel right now. They sat at the table in silence for a while. The clock ticked loudly in the background. His daughter, unaware of what had happened, ran into the kitchen with her school bag, laughing about something she saw on TV. Ethan forced a smile and helped her tie her shoes, pretending everything was fine. After she left for school, he sat on the couch staring out the window. His phone buzzed, messages from co-workers expressing shock and support. One of them wrote, You'll find something better. People like you don't stay down for long. He appreciated the words, but they didn't help much. Jobs were hard to find lately, especially for drivers his age. He opened his laptop and started looking at job listings, but most positions required night shifts or long-distance driving. He needed something steady, something close to home. By noon, he decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The streets were quiet, the same streets he had driven through countless times while delivering packages. Every corner reminded him of his job. He passed by the small grocery store where he had met Margaret. He thought about her kind smile and how she had offered him tea. For a moment, he wondered if she knew what had happened because of that night. He stopped near a bench and sat down, watching cars go by. A part of him felt angry at himself. Maybe he should have just driven past her. Maybe kindness really didn't pay off in this world, but another part of him refused to believe that. Helping someone shouldn't lead to punishment. It just shouldn't. When he went back home, his wife had made lunch. She smiled faintly, trying to lift his spirits. "We'll be okay," she said. "Maybe this is just a sign that something better's coming." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "I just wish I could see how." That evening, the sky turned gray and it started to rain softly. Ethan sat near the window, listening to the sound of the drops hitting the glass. He thought about all the times he had chosen work over rest, rules over heart. He had always believed that doing good eventually came back to you. But right now, it didn't feel that way. He took out the photo from his pocket, the one from his locker, and placed it on the table. His daughter was smiling in it, holding his hand at the park. That simple picture reminded him what really mattered. He wasn't just a delivery driver. He was a husband, a father, and most importantly, a man who still believed in kindness. As night fell, Ethan received a message from Steve again. "Herd management is replacing you already. It's not right." Ethan didn't reply. He just turned off his phone and sat in silence. He looked out at the rain, the lights of cars passing in the distance. For now, there was nothing else to do but wait for a chance, for something to change. He didn't know that change was already on its way. The next morning, long before sunrise, he was woken by a strange sound outside, the low rumble of engines. At first, he thought it was just garbage trucks, but when he looked out the window, he froze. Several large black SUVs were parked on the street in front of his house. They weren't moving. Their headlights were on, cutting through the misty morning air. Ethan's heart started to race. He had no idea who they were or what they wanted. He stood by the window staring, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Something was about to happen, something he never could have expected. Ethan stood frozen by the window, staring at the row of black SUVs parked outside his small house. The engines were still running, their headlights bright in the early morning fog. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, but the sound was too real. His heart began to beat faster. He stepped away from the window, unsure what to do. His wife, still in her robe, walked into the living room, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked softly. "I don't know," Ethan said, glancing back outside. "There are cars out front, big ones. I've never seen them here before." She walked to the window beside him and peeked through the curtain. "That's strange," she whispered. "Do you think it's some kind of mistake?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "I have no idea." Before they could say more, the front doorbell rang. A single firm sound that made both of them jump. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the sight of those SUVs made him uneasy. His wife whispered, "Be careful." He nodded, walked to the door, and opened it just slightly. Standing on the porch was a tall man in a dark suit and coat. He looked professional, not threatening, and behind him a few others waited near the vehicles. "Mr. Cole," the man asked politely. "Yes?" Ethan replied, his voice cautious. The man gave a small smile and extended a card. "My name is Richard Haynes. I apologize for the early visit, but I'd appreciate a few minutes of your time." "It's important." Ethan glanced at the card. It had a company logo he didn't recognize and the name, Haynes Security and Logistics Group. He frowned, confused. "What is this about?" "I promise it's nothing bad," the man said calmly. "May I come in for a moment?" "I just want to talk." Ethan hesitated, then opened the door wider. "All right, come in." Richard stepped inside and looked around politely, taking off his gloves. He seemed respectful, not pushy. His voice was calm, his movements measured. Ethan's wife stood nearby, watching carefully. "Please," Ethan said, motioning to the couch. "Have a seat." Richard sat down and placed a small folder on the coffee table. "First of all, Mr. Cole, I owe you a thank you, a very personal one." Ethan blinked. "A thank you?" "Yes," Richard said with a soft smile. "Yesterday evening you helped an elderly woman with her groceries. You probably didn't think much of it at the time, but that woman happens to be my mother." Ethan froze. "Your mother?" Richard nodded. "Her name is Margaret." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "The woman from the grocery store?" "The very same," Richard said. "She told me everything, how you stopped your van, helped her carry her bags, and made sure she got home safely. She also told me that you refused to take any money from her." Ethan sat back slowly, trying to process what he was hearing. I just did what anyone would have done," he said quietly. "She looked like she needed help," Richard smiled. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Cole. Not everyone would have done what you did. My mother said cars passed by her for nearly 10 minutes before you stopped. Most people didn't even slow down. Ethan shrugged. I didn't think about it that way. I just couldn't drive past her. I understand, Richard said. But that small decision, that act of kindness, meant a lot to her. She hasn't stopped talking about it since. Ethan smiled faintly. She's a sweet lady. She is, Richard agreed. She also told me something else, that you lost your job because of what you did. Ethan's smile faded. Yeah, he said softly. They said I broke company rules. They didn't care about the reason. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. That's what she told me too. When I heard it, I was angry. A man does the right thing, something decent, and gets punished for it. That's not how the world should work. Ethan didn't know what to say. He looked down at his hands. It's all right, he said after a moment. I'll find something else eventually. It's just bad timing, that's all. Richard shook his head. You shouldn't have to start over because of this. He reached into the folder and pulled out a few papers. Mr. Cole, I own a private logistics and security company. We operate across several states, handling sensitive deliveries and transportation for major clients. We value honesty and integrity above everything else. Ethan looked up, curious but cautious. I've been searching for people I can trust, people who do the right thing even when no one's watching. Richard continued. When my mother told me what happened, I knew I had to find you. That's why we're here. Ethan frowned slightly. You're saying you want to hire me? Richard smiled. I don't want to just hire you, Mr. Cole. I want you to lead one of our local teams. You've got experience and, more importantly, you've got character. We can teach skills, but we can't teach heart. For a moment, Ethan didn't speak. He thought he had misheard. Wait, he said slowly. You're offering me a job? After what happened? Yes, Richard said. A full-time position, better pay, proper benefits, and a company that values what you did, not punishes it. Ethan's wife, who had been standing quietly near the doorway, covered her mouth in surprise. Are you serious? She asked softly. Richard nodded. Completely, Ethan looked stunned. He had expected maybe a thank you or some polite conversation, but not this. I don't know what to say, he admitted. This is unexpected. Richard smiled kindly. Then just say yes. My mother will be happy to know her kindness came full circle. Ethan sat there for a moment, his thoughts racing. It felt unreal. Just yesterday he had been sitting in the same room, feeling like everything was falling apart. And now this stranger, this man whose mother he'd helped, was offering him a new beginning. I need a moment, Ethan said finally. Of course, Richard replied, giving him space. Ethan looked at his wife. Her eyes were full of hope and a tear slipped down her cheek. You deserve this, she whispered. You didn't do anything wrong. Take it. He took a deep breath and turned back to Richard. All right, he said quietly. I accept. Richard's smile widened. He reached across the table and shook Ethan's hand firmly. Welcome aboard, Mr. Cole. I have a feeling you're going to do great things. Ethan felt warmth rise in his chest, the kind that comes when life gives you a second chance you never expected. Richard stood up, put on his gloves, and said, Someone from my team will contact you later today with the details. We'll take care of everything. Paperwork, training, even transportation if you need it. And one more thing, he added, smiling. My mother insists that you come by for dinner this weekend. She wants to thank you in person. Ethan laughed softly, still processing everything. Please tell her I'd be happy to. After Richard left, the SUVs slowly pulled away from the street one by one, disappearing into the fog. The sound of their engines faded until everything was quiet again. Ethan and his wife stood on the porch watching them go. The morning sun was rising, shining through the trees. The world looked a little different and brighter somehow. His wife turned to him and said, Can you believe this? Ethan shook his head, still smiling in disbelief. No, yesterday I thought everything was over. And now? He stopped, unable to find the right words. She took his hand and said softly, Maybe kindness really does come back. He nodded. Maybe it does. That afternoon, he received a call from one of Richard's assistants confirming the new position. They sent him the job details, the salary, benefits, everything. It was far better than anything he'd ever had before. When he hung up the phone, he just sat there trying to take it all in. He spent the rest of the day with his family. His daughter came home from school and he told her in simple words that he had a new job. She jumped with excitement, hugged him tightly, and said, See? Good things happen to good people, Dad. Ethan laughed. Maybe you're right. That night, as he sat by the window watching the streetlights glow, he thought about how fast things had changed. Less than 24 hours ago, he was certain that his kindness had cost him everything. But now, it seemed that same kindness had opened a door he never even knew existed. He realized that sometimes life doesn't reward you immediately. Sometimes it waits, testing your faith, your patience, your belief in doing good. And then, when you least expect it, it gives back in ways you could never imagine. Ethan smiled quietly, feeling peace settle in his heart for the first time in days. The old worry that had been sitting on his chest was gone, replaced by something lighter, hope. He turned off the lights, went to bed, and whispered to himself, tomorrow's a new start. He didn't know it yet, but his story, the man who was fired for helping an old woman and found something greater because of it, was about to reach far beyond his small town. It was only the beginning. The next morning, Ethan woke up early, though this time it wasn't because of worry. It was excitement, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The sunlight coming through the window felt warmer than usual. For the first time in days, he wasn't dreading the day ahead. He had a new job waiting, one that came not from luck but from a moment of kindness he never thought anyone would notice. He got ready carefully, wearing his cleanest shirt and the only tie he owned. His wife watched him with a proud smile as she poured coffee into a cup. "You look nervous," she said gently. "A little," Ethan admitted. "It's just been a while since I started something new." "You'll be fine," she said. "You've earned this." He smiled, took his coffee, and kissed her forehead before stepping out the door. The air was cool and fresh, the kind of morning that made everything feel possible. When he arrived at the new company's office, it didn't look anything like his old workplace. It wasn't noisy or crowded. The building stood tall and clean with glass doors and a friendly receptionist who greeted him by name as soon as he walked in. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," she said with a smile. "Mr. Haynes is expecting you." Ethan nodded politely, feeling a little out of place in such a professional setting. He was led to a bright office on the second floor. Richard Haynes was already there, standing by the window, talking on the phone. When he saw Ethan, he ended the call and walked over with a warm handshake. "Ethan, I'm glad you're here," he said. "Come in, have a seat." Ethan sat down, still trying to absorb the fact that this man, someone who could easily have ignored what happened, had gone out of his way to find him. Richard poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one over. "How was your morning?" "Good," Ethan said with a small smile. "Feels strange not driving a delivery van today." Richard chuckled. "Well, that's about to change, but in a good way." He opened a folder on his desk and showed Ethan a few documents. "Here's your employment agreement, your position details, and the schedule for your orientation this week. You'll be overseeing our mid-region transport team. That means you'll manage a small group of drivers, review routes, and make sure deliveries run smoothly." Ethan nodded, looking at the papers carefully. "This is a big step up from what I'm used to." "It's not just about experience," Richard said. "It's about trust. You earned that the moment you stopped for my mother." Ethan smiled shyly. "I just did what felt right." Richard leaned back in his chair. "That's exactly what makes you right for this job." There was a pause as Ethan took in the office around him. The framed photos, the calm atmosphere, the sound of quiet conversation in the hallway. It all felt so different from the warehouse noise he used to live with every day. "I have to admit," Ethan said finally, "I'm still not sure why you went to all this trouble. You could have just sent me a thank you note and that would have been enough." Richard smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "You deserve to know the full story." Ethan looked up, curious. "My mother, Margaret," Richard began, "hasn't had an easy time lately. A few months ago, she had a small accident. Nothing too serious, but enough to make it hard for her to walk long distances. Since then, she's been a bit lonely. I visit her when I can, but I travel a lot for work. That night when you helped her, she told me later she was scared before you stopped. She thought she might fall. You didn't just carry her groceries. You gave her a moment of safety and kindness she hadn't felt in a while." Ethan listened quietly. Richard continued. "You see, I've built this company from the ground up. We deal with security, logistics, and transport. I've met hundreds of people, smart people, skilled people, but what's missing in most of them is heart. They follow rules, yes, but not values. When my mother told me what happened, it reminded me of something I used to believe in. That character matters more than numbers. He looked directly at Ethan. That's why I came looking for you. Ethan sat there unsure what to say. I don't know if I deserve all that, he said softly. I just did something small, Richard smiled. Sometimes small things show the biggest truth about who we are. There was a long, comfortable silence. Then Richard said, There's one more thing I wanted to tell you. He stood up and opened a drawer, pulling out a thin folder. Inside were printed articles and a few photos. He slid them across the desk toward Ethan. My mother's story, and yours, has already started spreading, he said. One of my friends in the media heard about it and asked if they could share it. I wasn't sure at first, but my mother insisted. She said the world needs to be reminded that kindness still exists. Ethan picked up one of the papers. There was a photo of him helping Margaret by her doorstep, taken by a neighbor across the street. The headline read, Delivery driver fired for helping elderly woman. Kindness overrules. Ethan's mouth fell open slightly. This is me, Richard nodded. It's been shared online thousands of times. People are talking about it, about how unfair it was, about how we've become too focused on rules and forgotten about compassion. You've started a conversation, Ethan, without even trying to. Ethan stared at the paper, speechless. I didn't mean for this to happen. I know, Richard said gently, and that's why it's powerful. You didn't do it for attention, and you did it because it was right. That's what makes people care. Ethan shook his head slowly, still in disbelief. All this from one act? Richard smiled. That's how it always begins. As the day went on, Ethan met some of the other employees, toured the facility, and learned about the work he'd be managing. Everyone was friendly and respectful. He could tell they looked at him with quiet curiosity. Maybe they already knew who he was. But instead of feeling uncomfortable, Ethan felt something new. Belonging. By afternoon, Richard called him back to his office for one final meeting. Before you go, he said, I want to show you something. He walked to the window and pointed to the parking area below. A small team of drivers was standing near a fleet of clean white trucks with the company logo. That's your team, Richard said. You'll start training them next week. I've told them a bit about you, enough for them to know they're in good hands. Ethan looked down at the group. The sight made him both nervous and proud. Richard turned to him and said, I know what happened at your last company still hurts. But remember this, sometimes doors close because we're meant to walk through better ones. You didn't lose your job. You outgrew it. Ethan smiled, the words sinking deep into him. Thank you, he said sincerely. For believing in me. Richard nodded. Don't thank me. Thank my mother. She sees good people long before I do. That evening, when Ethan returned home, his wife was waiting at the door. She could tell by the look on his face that the day had gone well. How was it? She asked, almost bursting with curiosity. It was amazing, he said, unable to stop smiling. You won't believe what I saw. They even showed me the article about what happened. People are actually talking about it. She laughed softly. I told you. Kindness always finds its way back. He sat down at the table, describing everything in detail. The office, the people, the conversation with Richard, and the offer to lead a team. His wife listened with shining eyes. Before bed, Ethan sat quietly by the window again, thinking about how strange life could be. One moment he was being fired for doing something good. The next he was being rewarded for the same thing. It was like life had turned everything upside down, only to set it right again. He thought about Margaret, how her simple smile that night had made him feel at peace even before any of this happened. He decided he'd bring her flowers when they met for dinner that weekend. As he looked up at the night sky, Ethan whispered to himself, maybe this world isn't as cold as I thought. He didn't know it yet, but the dinner with Margaret would bring one more surprise, something that would show him just how far one small act of kindness could truly go. The weekend arrived faster than Ethan expected. He spent the morning polishing his shoes, ironing his shirt, and double-checking the small bouquet of flowers sitting on the table. They were bright yellow tulips, the kind his wife said always made people smile. He felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Even though he had met Margaret only once, it somehow felt like visiting an old friend. His wife looked up from her cup of tea. You're sure she's expecting you? Yes, Ethan said with a smile. Her son arranged it. He said she's been waiting to see me again. She nodded approvingly. Well, don't be late, and don't come home without telling me every single thing she says. Ethan laughed. You'll be the first to know. He got into his car and drove toward the same quiet street where it had all begun. The road looked just as it did that night, lined with small houses, trees bending gently with the wind, the same old lamppost flickering near the corner. He could almost see his old delivery van parked there the night he stopped to help. When he reached Margaret's house, she was already standing by the door, waiting. She wore a light sweater and had a warm smile that could melt anyone's heart. Ethan, my dear boy, she said as he walked up the driveway. You came. Of course, he said, handing her the flowers. I hope you like these. They're beautiful, she said, holding them close. Come in, come in. I've made lunch, but I might have gone a little overboard. He followed her inside. The house was cozy and filled with sunlight. There were framed photos on every wall, family gatherings, vacations, moments frozen in time. It smelled like home-cooked food and something sweet baking in the oven. Margaret guided him to the kitchen table where a meal was already set. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and her homemade pie. I haven't cooked this much in years, she said proudly. Ethan smiled. It all looks amazing. You didn't have to go through so much trouble. Nonsense, she said, waving her hand. It's not every day someone saves an old lady from carrying her life uphill. They both laughed, and for a while they just ate and talked. Margaret asked about his new job, his family, and how he was settling in. Ethan told her everything. How different the new place was, how kind the people were, and how grateful he felt. I owe it all to you, he said softly. She looked surprised. To me, oh no, you don't owe me a thing, Ethan, you earned it. You showed kindness when no one else did. That came from your heart, he shook his head. If it weren't for you telling your son what happened, I'd still be out there wondering what to do next. Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand gently. Maybe, but maybe you were meant to meet us. Sometimes life brings people together for reasons we don't see right away. Ethan nodded slowly. Her words stayed with him. After lunch, they moved to the living room. Margaret poured tea and sat beside him on the couch. You know, she said, after that night I thought about you a lot. I told everyone at church about how a young man stopped his truck and helped an old woman who could barely carry her groceries. You reminded me of my late husband. He was the same way. Always believed that kindness never goes unseen. Ethan smiled, touched by her words. He sounds like a good man. He was, she said softly. And he would have liked you. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their tea. The clock ticked quietly in the background, and the sunlight danced through the lace curtains. It was one of those rare, peaceful afternoons where time seemed to slow down. After a while, Margaret stood up and said, I have something for you. She walked to a small wooden cabinet in the corner and opened a drawer. From it, she pulled out a simple brown envelope and handed it to him. What's this? Ethan asked. Just open it, she said with a little smile. Inside the envelope was an old photograph. It showed a much younger Margaret standing beside a delivery truck, holding a small box. Next to her was a man wearing a company uniform and smiling proudly. That's my husband, she said. He used to work as a delivery driver too back in the day. The photo was taken the year he got promoted. He worked hard his whole life, always did the right thing, even when it cost him. When I saw you that night, I saw him again. That same honesty in your eyes. Ethan looked at the photo and felt a lump in his throat. Thank you, he said quietly. This means more than I can say. I want you to have it, she said firmly. As a reminder, no matter how hard life gets, doing the right thing always leads you somewhere better. Ethan didn't know what to say. He just nodded, carefully placing the photo back into the envelope. Before he could respond, there was a knock on the door. Margaret smiled knowingly. That must be Richard, she said. A moment later, Richard walked in, his face lighting up when he saw them. I thought I'd stop by and see how my favorite people are doing, Margaret laughed. You're just in time for pie. As they sat together, the three of them shared stories about work, family, and life. Richard asked Ethan how things were going at the new office, and Ethan explained how much he was learning every day.